I drove my old Chevy Silverado to the mediation that morning. The one with the cracked dashboard and the passenger side mirror held on with electrical tape. I'd had it for 11 years. My wife, my soon-to-be ex-wife, used to call it an embarrassment. She said she was ashamed to be seen getting out of it at the country club. I never told her that I agreed with her, not about the shame part, about the truck. I loved that truck. I wore a grey polo shirt I'd bought at Costco 3 years ago. $9 maybe, 11 at most. I'd washed it the night before and hung it up so it wouldn't wrinkle. That detail matters. You'll understand why later. Her name was Vivian. We'd been married 22 years. We had a daughter named Claire who was 16 and trying very hard to pretend that her parents splitting up wasn't destroying her. She was too much like me for that to work. She felt everything and said nothing. I watched her get on the school bus that morning from the kitchen window, her backpack too big for her frame, and I thought, whatever happens today, whatever Vivian's attorney says, whatever gets decided in that room, Claire is the reason I did all of it. Every single decision I made in the last 3 years. Everyone. I need to back up. 26 years ago, before Vivian, before Claire, before any of it, I started a small environmental consulting firm out of the spare bedroom of my apartment in Columbus, Ohio. Just me, a used laptop, and a client list that fit on a single index card. My name is Lawrence. Lawrence Holt. Nobody called me Lawrence except my mother when she was angry. Everyone called me Ren. Still do. The firm was called Greystone Environmental. We did soil remediation assessments, cleanup consulting for industrial sites, contamination studies. Not glamorous work, not the kind of thing you explain at dinner parties without watching people's eyes glaze over, but it was necessary work. And I was good at it. Over 15 years, I built Greystone into something real. We had 43 employees at the peak. We had federal contracts. We had a reputation in the Midwest that I was genuinely proud of. I wasn't on magazine covers. I wasn't being invited to give TED Talks. I drove that same Silverado to job sites and wore whatever was clean that day and never once thought about whether any of that looked impressive. 4 years ago, I sold Greystone to a larger environmental services group out of Denver. I won't say the number. I'll say it was enough that my financial advisor said, "Ren, you don't have to work another day in your life if you don't want to." I told her I didn't know what I'd do with myself if I didn't work. She said that was a problem she'd be happy to help me with. After the sale, I took a part-time consulting position with the Ohio EPA. It was not a prestigious job. I drove a government vehicle to field sites, wrote technical reports, made about $41,000 a year. I did it because I liked the work, because it kept me connected to something real, because sitting in an office managing investments felt like dying slowly. Vivian knew I'd sold Greystone. She was there when it happened. We'd gone out to dinner to celebrate. A quiet dinner, her idea. She ordered the salmon. I remember that specifically because she sent it back once. But here's the thing about Vivian. She wasn't interested in the details. She was interested in what the details meant for her life. And in her mind, my life after the sale looked exactly like my life before it. A man who drove an old truck and worked a government job and wore Costco polo shirts. She'd been trying to change those things about me for years. After the sale, she stopped trying and started resenting the structure of what I did with the money from Greystone. The trust, the accounts, the long-term arrangements that was handled by my attorney, a man named Philip who I'd worked with for 15 years. Philip is the kind of attorney who makes other attorneys nervous. He's quiet. He asks questions that seem simple until you're answering them and realize they aren't simple at all. He told me when I first sat down with him about the sale proceeds, "Ren, you need to think about this not just as wealth management, but as asset protection." I asked him what he meant. He explained it carefully. I listened. I'm not going to pretend I saw the divorce coming. I didn't. That's the part I'm still not entirely at peace with. I thought we were struggling, but I thought struggles were things you worked through. I didn't know Vivian had already decided. She told me on a Tuesday evening in March. Claire was at swim practice. The house was quiet. Vivian was very calm. She'd clearly thought about how she wanted to say it. She said she hadn't been happy for a long time. She said she felt like we were strangers. She said the word fulfilled 3 times. I counted later when I was lying in the guest room trying to sleep. I said, okay, not because I felt okay. Because I didn't know what else to say. The next morning I called Philip. Now, here is where the mediation comes in. Vivian's attorney was a man named Clifford Stowe. I knew of Clifford Stowe by reputation. He was known in Columbus legal circles as aggressive, theatrical, and extremely effective at asset discovery in high-net-worth divorces. Vivian had done her research. I respected that, in a distant, hollow way. The mediation was held at Clifford's firm downtown. 12th floor, floor-to-ceiling windows, a view of the Scioto River. I parked the Silverado in the visitor lot and walked in carrying a folder with some notes and a bottle of water I'd filled at home. The receptionist looked at me the way people sometimes look at a delivery driver who walks into the wrong office. Philip was already there. He was wearing a charcoal suit and reading something on his phone. He looked up when I walked in and gave me the nod that meant, "We're fine." Vivian arrived a few minutes later with Clifford. She was dressed impeccably, the way she always was when she wanted to make a point without saying anything. Clifford had the easy confidence of a man who has done this 1,000 times and expects to win. We sat down at the conference table. Clifford opened his folder, smiled in a way that didn't reach his eyes, and said, "Mr. Holt, before we begin, I want to acknowledge that you've chosen to have representation today." A glance at Philip. Smart decision. Philip said nothing. Just opened his own folder. Clifford began laying out their position. Vivian was entitled to a substantial portion of marital assets. Their documentation of those assets showed my annual income from the Ohio EPA position, $41,200, my pension contributions, my modest investment accounts. He presented this picture methodically, like he was building a case, because he was. Then he said it. He said, "Mr. Holt's current financial position makes it clear that expecting significant support is unrealistic." He set down a page. He looked at me. He said, "I have to ask, are you representing that this is a complete picture of your financial situation?" I looked at Philip. Philip looked at me. Clifford pressed forward. He had a particular tone, not quite contemptuous, but close. The tone of a man who is certain he is the most informed person in the room. He said something about wanting to ensure this process was transparent for everyone. He glanced at my shirt. Just briefly. Just enough. Vivian had her hands folded on the table. She looked like she was trying to appear neutral and not quite managing it. Philip leaned forward slightly. He said, "Clifford, before we discuss asset disclosure, I'd like to submit some documents for the record." He opened the second folder, the one I hadn't seen him bring, and slid a stack of papers across the table. Clifford picked them up. He started reading. The room was quiet for about 45 seconds. Then Clifford said, "What is this?" Philip said, "That's the Greystone environmental sale documentation, the subsequent Holt family trust filing with the Ohio court, the federal tax returns for the past 4 years, and the relevant trust schedule. I think you'll find it answers your question about completeness." Clifford kept reading. Vivian looked at Clifford. I looked to the window. The river was flat and grey in the November light. "You sold the company," Clifford said. He wasn't looking at me. He was still looking at the documents. Philip said, "Mr. Holt disclosed the sale of Greystone Environmental at the time of the transaction. It is a matter of public record. The sale proceeds were placed into a properly structured trust, which is also properly documented." Clifford set the papers down. He took a breath. He said, "These figures weren't included in your initial disclosure." Philip said quietly, "The initial disclosure listed all current income and assets. The trust documentation was available upon request. No one requested it. There's a particular quality to silence in a conference room when something has gone very wrong for one side of the table. It's not just quiet, it's pressurized. You can feel the other person recalibrating, deciding what to say next, deciding whether what they say next will make things better or worse. Clifford spent about 30 seconds in that silence. Then he said, "We'll need a recess." I said, "Take all the time you need." Vivian looked at me then. Really looked at me. I don't know what she was trying to read in my face. I tried to give her nothing useful. Not out of cruelty, out of exhaustion. We had been looking past each other for years. I didn't have anything left to perform. During the recess, Philip and I stood in the hallway near the elevator. He got a coffee from a cart. I drank my water from home. He said, "You doing all right?" I said, "Ask me in an hour." He nodded. He understood. I want to tell you something about Philip, because it matters to understanding all of this. Philip is not a dramatic man. He doesn't build two moments. He doesn't perform competence. He is simply always the most prepared person in the room. He had anticipated every element of this morning. Every document, every question, every silence. He had told me 6 months ago when this process was just beginning. "Ren, we are going to do this correctly. That means no surprises. For you. There will be surprises for the other side, but not for you." He was right. We went back into the conference room. Clifford had regrouped. I'll give him credit for that. He was a professional. He said, "We'd like to discuss the trust structure and what portion of those assets the court would consider marital property." Philip said, "We're happy to discuss that. You'll note in the filing that the trust was established and funded after the marriage, yes, but the business was founded and developed primarily before the marriage, and during periods when Mrs. Holt was not involved in the business in any operational or financial capacity. We have documentation of that as well." Vivian's jaw tightened slightly. Clifford said, "Mrs. Holt contributed to the household during the years Mr. Holt built the business." Philip said, "That's true, and the marital asset sheet reflects the equity in the home, the joint retirement accounts, and the joint investment accounts. Those are not in dispute. What is in dispute is whether the trust, which was structured specifically around the business proceeds, constitutes marital property in a way that entitles Mrs. Holt to a portion of it." "The courts have been clear," Clifford began. "Ohio courts have been nuanced," Philip said pleasantly. "We're happy to litigate that question if necessary. But I suspect, given the documentation, that there's a conversation to be had here about what a reasonable settlement looks like." Another silence. Clifford looked at Vivian. Vivian looked at the table. "Here is something I want you to understand about that moment. I was not triumphant. I know how these stories are supposed to go. The wronged party, the dramatic reveal, the enemy crumbling, and I won't pretend there wasn't some part of me that felt something sharp and brief when the paper slid across that table. But mostly what I felt was tired and sad. 22 years. A daughter who cried herself to sleep in a house she was about to have to choose between. A marriage that had ended long before that Tuesday evening in March. I didn't want to win. I wanted it to be fair. I wanted Claire to be okay. Those are not the same thing, and I had stopped confusing them. The mediation continued for another 2 hours. Philip was methodical. Clifford was careful. Vivian said very little directly to me. At one point she said, "To the room in general, I just want what's fair." And I believed her. I think she actually believed that herself. The settlement we reached that day was not a victory for me in any cinematic sense. I contributed substantially to Claire's education and future needs. I kept the bulk of the trust intact. The house. Vivian's house, really. The one she'd decorated and maintained and made into the kind of home I was mostly just a guest in. Went to her. She received a fair portion of the joint assets. Clifford's opening position evaporated, but Clifford's revised position wasn't nothing. But here's what I kept. The Silverado. The Costco polo shirts. My consulting work with the EPA, which I still do 3 days a week because I genuinely think it matters. My Saturday mornings with Claire, who makes terrible coffee and watches nature documentaries and has started asking me about environmental science in a way that makes me think she might actually be interested in it. My apartment in Clintonville, which is small and doesn't have a dishwasher and has a view of someone else's fence. My name. My actual name, the full weight of it, which means something in certain rooms even when I walk into those rooms in a $9 shirt. I told Claire about the mediation a few days later. Not the details, just that things were being handled fairly and that she didn't need to worry about the money side of things. She asked me, "Are you okay, Dad? Like actually okay?" She sounds older than 16 when she asks things like that. I said, "I'm the best I've been in a while." She looked at me the way teenagers look at adults when they're deciding whether to believe them. I said, "I mean it." She said, "Okay." And she went back to a documentary, and I sat on the couch next to her, and the narrator on the television was explaining something about migratory patterns, and the room smelled like the bad coffee she'd made, and I thought, this is mine. This specific moment, this small apartment, this kid who inherited my stubbornness and my tendency to feel everything quietly. This is mine. I drove home from the mediation that day in the Silverado with the cracked dashboard. I stopped at the diner on Fifth Avenue and had eggs and coffee and sat by the window for a while. Nobody looked at me. Nobody knew what had happened in that conference room 12 floors above the river. The waitress called me on and refilled my coffee without asking. I left a good tip. I always do. There's a version of this story where I walk out of that building transformed, where the reveal of who I really am changes everything, where Vivian is devastated, where I feel vindicated. That version is satisfying in a way I understand. I've read stories like that. I've watched them. There's a real pleasure in that shape. But this is what actually happened. I ate my ex. I drove home. I called Claire. I called Philip to thank him. I sat in my apartment and looked at the fence outside my window and felt something that was complicated and quiet, and mine. People talk about winning like it's a feeling that fills you up. In my experience, what it actually feels like is more like setting something down that you've been carrying for a long time, not joy. Just the absence of weight. I'm 58 years old. I built something real once. I'm trying to build something real again. Smaller this time, more careful. A relationship with my daughter that doesn't have anything to perform in it. A life that doesn't require impressing anyone. I wore a $9 Costco polo shirt to the most important meeting of my financial life. Clifford Stowe glanced at it like it told him everything he needed to know about me. He wasn't entirely wrong. It did tell him something about me. He just misread what it said. I've thought a lot about what actually happened in that room on the 12th floor. Not the legal part. The human part. Clifford Stowe walked in that morning already certain of the story. He saw the truck in the lot, probably. He saw the polo shirt. He saw a man who, by every visible measure, looked like he had nothing to hide because he had nothing at all. And he built his entire morning around that assumption. That's not a legal mistake. That's a human one. The belief that what you can see is all there is. I've made that mistake too. I want to be honest about that. I spent years assuming that Vivian's unhappiness was something that would resolve itself if I just kept doing the work, kept building, kept being steady. I looked at the surface of our marriage and told myself the foundation was solid. I wasn't reading carefully enough either. We were both in our own ways working from incomplete information. What I know now, and I mean really know, not just intellectually, but in the way you know things after they cost you something. Is that how you carry yourself when no one is watching? Is the only version of yourself that's actually real? The Silverado wasn't a statement. The Costco shirt wasn't a strategy. That was just me. That's who I am when I'm not performing anything for anyone. And it turned out that who I am when I'm not performing was more solid than anything I could have dressed up to look like in that conference room. There's something I want to say about Philip, because I think it matters. Philip didn't win that mediation. The truth did. Philip just made sure the truth was in the room, organized, documented, impossible to dismiss. That's what preparation actually looks like. Not flash, not intimidation, just the quiet, relentless work of making sure that what's real cannot be buried under what looks good on paper. I think about that a lot. I think about how much of life rewards the people who do that slow, unglamorous work, who build things that are actually sound instead of things that merely appear to be. Claire asked me once, a few weeks after everything settled, whether I was angry. She meant at her mother. I told her no, and she gave me that look, the teenager look that means she doesn't quite believe me but is deciding to let it go. The truth is more complicated than anger. I was sad. I was tired. And underneath both of those things I was grateful, which surprised me. Grateful that it happened while Claire was still young enough that we could build something honest between us. Grateful that I had spent 26 years doing real work that turned out to actually be real. Grateful that when the moment came for me to be seen clearly, there was something worth seeing. You don't get to choose what people assume about you. You only get to choose who you actually are, and then you wait, and you do the work, and you trust, not in luck, not in fate, but in the plain and honest logic that what is genuinely built tends, eventually, to stand. What is built on assumption tends, eventually, to fall. I ate eggs at a diner after it was over. The waitress called me on. I left a good tip. That was enough. It was, in fact, exactly enough.